The cigar smoke in the back room of the Italian restaurant on Pleasant Avenue hung suspended in the air, thick and blue, refusing to rise. It was a suffocating silence. 4 men sat around a heavy oak table. 3 of them were comfortable. They were captains in the Genovese crime family, men who had grown fat and rich in the decade since Bumpy Johnson had been sent away to Alcatraz. They wore silk suits that cost more than a Harlem family made in a year. They reeked of cologne and arrogance. The 4th man sat perfectly still. He wore an outdated suit, cut for a different era. His face was a road map of 1,000 hard decisions, etched deep around eyes that gave absolutely nothing away. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson. He had been home for 48 hours. No one spoke. The only sound was the rhythmic, wet chewing of fat Tony Salerno at the head of the table, working a piece of gristle from his teeth. They were waiting for Bumpy to speak first. They were waiting for him to beg for a piece of the action they had stolen from him. Or maybe they were waiting for him to explode, to show the legendary temper that had left bodies scattered from 110th Street to Sugar Hill in the old days. If he begged, they would throw him crumbs. If he exploded, the 2 young soldiers standing by the kitchen door with their hands deep in their coat pockets would put him down before he stood up. Bumpy did neither. He just watched the ash grow longer on the end of his cigarette, a precarious gray tower. The air conditioner hummed, a nervous vibration in the wall. A bead of sweat tracked a slow path down Salerno's temple, despite the chill in the room. Why wasn't he talking? The old Bumpy would have flipped the table by now. The rock must have broken him. That's what they told themselves. They needed to believe it. But as the silence stretched past the point of comfort, past the point of disrespect, a terrifying thought began to bloom in the minds of the Italian captains. The way he sat there, not like a petitioner, not like a has-been. He sat like a judge. He took a slow drag from the cigarette, the glowing cherry illuminating the hard planes of his face. He exhaled a plume of smoke that drifted directly toward Salerno, stinging his eyes. Bumpy didn't blink. He just looked at them, one by one, with a terrifying, ancient patience. He knew something. They could feel it pressing against their chests. He knew something that was about to turn this room and the entire city upside down. And he was in absolutely no hurry to tell them what it was. If you're drawn to the untold power stories of Harlem and the men who ruled without noise, you're already in the right place. This is Bumpy Johnson Files. Subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is right now. The history books will tell you that when Bumpy Johnson returned from Alcatraz in 1963, he came home a relic. They say he was an old lion with dull teeth stepping into a jungle that had forgotten his roar. The police reports filed him away as inactive. The newspapers gave his return a paragraph on page 10. They said the 60s belonged to the new breed, to the heroin explosion, to a volatility that had no use for the old codes of honor. They lied. What really happened in those first critical weeks after the steel doors of the federal penitentiary slammed shut behind him was not a retirement. It was the single most sophisticated, psychologically devastating chess game ever played for the soul of New York City. These files were buried deep because they revealed an uncomfortable truth that the powers that be didn't want known. The truth that one man, armed with nothing but intellect and a terrifying reputation, could paralyze an entire criminal empire without ever pulling a trigger. This isn't the story of how Bumpy tried to get his power back. This is the story of the terrifying moment his enemies realized he had never actually lost it. But before the power, before the strategy, you have to understand the man who stepped off that train. You have to feel the cold wind that hit him on the platform. Imagine being asleep for 10 years, and while you slept, they came into your house, rearranged the furniture, changed the locks, and sold your belongings to strangers. Bumpy Johnson was brilliant, yes. He was ruthless, absolutely. But stepping back onto 125th Street in 1963, he felt something he hadn't felt since he was a shivering kid from Charleston. He felt vulnerable. Harlem had changed. The music was faster, frantic bebop replaced by harder rhythms. The hope of the post-war years had curdled into frustration. The civil rights movement was exploding, bringing a different kind of heat to the streets. The young hustlers on the corners didn't wear fedoras, they wore pork pie hats and shades, and their eyes were glazed with a new kind of hunger. They looked right through him. To them, Bumpy was a bedtime story their fathers told them, a ghost from a black and white photograph. For the first few days, he just walked. He walked the blocks he used to own, from sidewalk to rooftop. He felt the vibration of the pavement through the thin soles of his prison-issued shoes. He saw the Italian syndicate's trucks making deliveries in broad daylight in territory that used to be sacred ground for his organization. He saw the fear in the eyes of the old shopkeepers who remembered him, a fear mixed with pity. Poor Bumpy, their eyes said. The world moved on. He sat in a small diner on Lenox Avenue, drinking coffee that tasted like dishwater, watching a young dealer flash a roll of bills thick enough to choke a horse. The kid was sloppy, loud, drawing heat. In the old days, Bumpy would have had that kid tutored in the alley within the hour. Now, he just watched. The doubt wasn't a scream, it was a whisper in the back of his own skull. Are you finished, Ellsworth? Did the rock grind you down just enough so you can't fit back into the puzzle? The pain of that doubt was sharper than any prison shank. He was a king without a castle, standing in the rain, wondering if he still knew how to build. He knew he couldn't fight them with muscle. He didn't have the army anymore. His old lieutenants were dead, in prison, or working for the Italians now. If he tried to come in shooting, he'd be just another dead old gangster within a week. He had to do something they didn't expect. He had to be something they had forgotten to fear. He didn't announce his return. There were no grand meetings. He moved like a shadow that had suddenly detached itself from a wall. He started small. He visited the mothers of men who had died serving him. He sat in their living rooms, drank tea from delicate cups, and left envelopes of cash on the mantelpiece. Not much, just enough to show respect. He stopped by the old pool halls. He didn't play. He just stood in the corner, watching the angles, nodding slowly when a difficult shot was made. The young bucks would glance over, sneering at first. Who's the old head? But then they'd catch his eye. And that's where it started. The eyes. 10 years in Alcatraz, staring at the cold gray waters of the San Francisco Bay, hadn't dimmed them. It had clarified them. They were voids. They held no emotion, no fear, just a terrifying, calculating intelligence. When Bumpy Johnson looked at you in 1963, you felt like he was reading your autopsy report before you were even dead. The whispers began to circulate, rustling through the tenements like dry leaves. You see him? Yeah, he looks different. Quiet. Too quiet. He was re-establishing presence. He was letting the street feel his weight again. He was reminding them that gravity doesn't need to shout to hold you down. The Italians, ensconced in their social clubs in East Harlem, heard the whispers too. At first, they laughed. Fat Tony Salerno, the emerging power in the Genovese family, dismissed him with a wave of a sausage-like finger. "He's a museum piece," Salerno said, sipping anisette. "Give him a little numbers route. Let him earn beer money. If he gets loud, we squash him." They made the classic mistake of the arrogant. They confused silence with weakness. They sent a low-level associate, a man named Vinny the Roach, to deliver the message to Bumpy. It was an insult, a calculated disrespect. Vinny found Bumpy sitting on a park bench near Morningside Park, reading a newspaper. Vinny didn't sit down. He stood over Bumpy, blocking his light. "Vinny," Bumpy said softly, his voice like gravel being poured on velvet, "your mother, Mrs. Moretti, does she still live in that brownstone on 114th, the one with the red geraniums in the window boxes?" Vinny stopped chewing. The gum turned to cement in his mouth. "What?" Bumpy finally looked up, the eyes locked on to Vinny. Vinny felt his bladder tighten. "Nice lady," Bumpy said. "Always made good gravy on Sundays. It would be a shame if she had to move because the neighborhood got unsafe." Vinny took a step back. He wasn't facing a threat of violence. He was facing something far worse. He was facing a man who knew exactly where his heart lived and was gently squeezing it. "Go back to Anthony," Bumpy said, returning to his newspaper. "Tell him I appreciate the offer. Tell him I'll be in touch when I'm ready to discuss business. And Vinny, tell your mother I said hello." Vinny ran. He didn't walk back to East Harlem. He ran. The message was delivered, not the one Salerno sent, but the one Bumpy returned. He wasn't asking for permission, and he wasn't afraid to cross lines that even the Italians thought were sacred. The tension began to ratchet up. The streets felt it. The air grew heavier. The young black hustlers who had been ignoring him now watched him with wary curiosity. This old man had just punked a made guy without standing up. Maybe the legend wasn't dead. Bumpy knew that this small victory meant nothing if he didn't capitalize on it. He needed an ally, someone who understood the new world, someone with intellectual weight that matched his own. He didn't go to the other gangsters, he went to the mosque. The meeting between Bumpy Johnson and Malcolm X is one of those moments history tried to erase because it was too complicated for the simple narratives. The gangster and the prophet, the sinner and the saint, but they were two sides of the same Harlem coin. Both brilliant, both feared by the white establishment, both dedicated to the upliftment of their people, albeit by very different methods. They met late at night in the back office of the Nation of Islam's restaurant. Malcolm, tall, ascetic, burning with righteous intensity. Bumpy, solid, immovable, a mountain of dark pragmatism. They didn't talk about drugs or territory. They talked about power. "They think you're obsolete, Brother Ellsworth," Malcolm said, his voice sharp and clear. "They think the white man's prison broke your spirit." "The prison only sharpens the mind, Minister," Bumpy replied, sipping water. "It removes distractions. It teaches you patience." "Patience is a luxury we no longer have," Malcolm retorted. "Our people are rising up. The streets are on fire. You can't control fire with old methods." "Fire burns itself out if it isn't managed," Bumpy said calmly. "You need structure. You need discipline. The Italians have it. That's why they're winning. Our young brothers out there, they have energy, but they have no direction. They're eating each other." Malcolm studied the older man. He saw the intelligence that rivaled his own. He saw a potential weapon. "What do you want?" "I want what was mine, not just the money, the respect, the order, and I need to know the landscape. You see things from the pulpit that I can't see from the street." A silent accord was struck in that room. It wasn't an alliance of friends. It was an alignment of interests. Malcolm needed Bumpy's stabilizing influence on the chaotic street elements to protect his movement. Bumpy needed Malcolm's moral authority and his deep understanding of the shifting political tides. Word leaked out that Bumpy sat with Malcolm. The street vibrated. The old king was aligning with the new power. This wasn't just gangster business anymore. This was something bigger. Salerno and the Italians were getting nervous. Bumpy wasn't acting right. He wasn't attacking, but he wasn't submitting. He was weaving a web. They decided it was time to cut the threads before the web got too thick. They called the meeting at the restaurant on Pleasant Avenue. It wasn't an invitation, it was a summons. Which brings us back to that smoke-filled room, the silence, the ash hanging precariously from Bumpy's cigarette. Salerno finally cracked. He slammed his heavy hand on the table, making the silverware jump. "Enough with the theater, Bumpy," Salerno barked, his face reddening. "You think you're cute? You think you can mess with my people and just sit there? You're nothing. You're a ghost. We let you live out of respect for the old days, but that respect just ran out." The other captains murmured in agreement, leaning forward like vultures sensing weakness. The soldiers by the door tensed. Bumpy slowly reached out and tapped the ash into an ashtray. He looked at Salerno with an almost clinical detachment. "Anthony," Bumpy said, his voice barely above a whisper, forcing them to lean in to hear him. "You're shouting. It shows a lack of confidence." Salerno looked ready to stroke out. "You listen to me, you old—" "No," Bumpy interrupted, not loudly, but with a finality that cut the air like a razor. "You listen to me." He leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the table. The change in posture was terrifying. The judge was about to pass sentence. "You think Alcatraz was just a cage. You think I just sat there counting the days. You're wrong. Alcatraz was a university, the best university for criminology in the world. Everyone passes through the rock eventually. The bank robbers, the con men, the killers, the bookkeepers." He paused, letting the words sink in. "I met a man there, a fascinating little man from Chicago, used to do the books for the outfit out there. He had a photographic memory from numbers. We played chess every day for 3 years. While we played, he talked. He loved to talk about how clever he was with hidden accounts." Salerno's eyes flickered, a tiny crack in the facade. Bumpy continued, his voice monotonous, hypnotic. "Then there was a kid from Queens, a real hothead. Did a job for your family back in '58 that went bad. He was very bitter about how he was treated. He told me stories about where certain bodies were buried in the Jersey Meadowlands, very specific locations, near the exit 16W ramp." One of the other captains shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His face had gone pale. "And you know," Bumpy said, looking directly at Salerno now, a small, cold smile touching the corners of his mouth, "I had a lot of time to think about the docks, the unions, the way money moves from the Longshoremen's Fund into certain construction projects in Midtown, projects that your boss, Don Genovese, doesn't know you're skimming from." The silence in the room now was different. It wasn't thick, it was shattered glass. Salerno was frozen, His mouth hung slightly open. The sweat on his face was cold now. Bumpy had them. He didn't have a gun. He didn't have an army outside. He had information. He had spent 10 years collecting the secrets of the underworld, piece by piece, from men who thought they were just passing time with an old has-been. He had woven those pieces into a noose, and he had just gently placed it around their collective necks. "If I walk out of here," Bumpy said, leaning back and lighting another cigarette with steady hands, "nothing happens. The information stays in my head. If I don't walk out of here, well, let's just say there are letters already written, addressed to the FBI, to the IRS, and most importantly, to Don Genovese himself. They get mailed tomorrow morning if I don't make a phone call by midnight." He took a drag. "So, Anthony, who's really in charge in this room? The man with the loud voice and the soldiers by the door, or the man who knows where the skeletons are buried and has the shovel ready?" Salerno looked at the other captains. They wouldn't meet his eyes. They were terrified. They knew Bumpy wasn't bluffing. His reputation for intellect was greater than his reputation for violence. If he said he had the goods, he had the goods. Bumpy Johnson had just taken over a room full of killers without raising his voice. He had weaponized their own corruption against them. The tension didn't break, it dissolved into defeat. Salerno slumped back in his chair, defeated. The air went out of him. "What do you want, Bumpy?" Salerno asked, his voice hollow. "I want what is mine," Bumpy repeated. "Everything from 1/10 to 1/55th, the numbers, the dope, the protection, all of it. You pull your people back, you stay downtown. You cross 1/10th Street, you pay a tax to me, a heavy tax." That's everything," Salerno stammered. "That's the price of my silence," Bumpy said. "It's a bargain, Anthony. Think of the alternative, prison, or a visit from your own boss's hitmen." He stood up slowly. He buttoned his old-fashioned suit jacket. He didn't look back at them. He walked toward the kitchen door. The two soldiers, who a moment ago would have put a bullet in his head, stepped aside nervously, like he was radioactive. Bumpy Johnson walked out of that restaurant into the cool night air of East Harlem. He hadn't fired a shot. He hadn't thrown a punch. He had just reclaimed his kingdom with pure psychological warfare. News of that meeting spread through the streets before morning. It didn't travel like normal gossip. It traveled like mythology. The details were hazy, but the outcome was undeniable. The Italians had bowed down. Bumpy had walked into the lion's den and walked out wearing a fur coat. The effect was instantaneous. The young hustlers on the corners, the ones who had sneered, suddenly looked at him with awe. They realized that the stories weren't just stories. They realized that this old man possessed a kind of power they didn't understand, a power born of discipline, intelligence, and absolute fearlessness. Bumpy didn't have to fight for control anymore. It was handed back to him on a platter of terrified respect. The old structure returned, but tougher, smarter. He imposed order on the chaos. He became the stabilizing force in a Harlem that was threatening to tear itself apart. He sat on his throne for 5 more years before his death. They were bloody years, turbulent years, but he remained untouched, the calm eye in the center of the storm. He had learned the ultimate lesson in that cold cell on Alcatraz. He realized that true power isn't about how loud you can shout or how hard you can hit. True power is the ability to make your enemy believe that their destruction is inevitable if they cross you, without you having to lift a finger. He didn't come back to fight for Harlem. He came back to remind them that he was Harlem. The king didn't need a crown, he just needed the chair at the head of the table, and the patience to wait for everyone else to realize it was his. This is Bumpy Johnson Files. Subscribe for the stories history tried to bury.